Okay, today is July 24th, 2007. I am Jessica Clark. It is a pleasure to conduct this interview for the Dakota Memories Oral History Project in Bismarck, North Dakota. To start with, can you please state your full name?
Jacob Helbling.
And where were you born, Jacob?
At home in Morton County in south of Mandan.
And when were you born?
July 21st, 1920, July 23rd, 1921.
And did you ever hear a story about your birth?
Well, I think my grandmother was there to assist my mother when I was born. And my oldest sister said she remembers that when I was born, the same bedroom that I sleep every day,
How old is
every
your
night.
How old is your oldest sister?
She's going to be 92 now, the 25th of July.
And how many years older than you is she?
15, about 7, huh? 50 to 21 would be 27 years old.
7 years.
Yeah, so she was 7 years old at that time when I was born.
Can you share one of your earliest childhood memories with me?
Well, let's see, I would say the first years I went to school, I remember that real well in 1927 when I went to school the first year.
What was that like?
Well, we walked 3 miles in the spring when our folks needed the horses for farming. And we didn't have that horse, so we'd walk sometimes to 3 miles of school till we got a Shetland pony and put him on a buggy, and then we drove to school with the Shetland pony. My brother, Matt, he's born in 18, he drove, and Monica and me and Ida, we sat on that little buggy and went to school 3 miles. Once in a while we'd walk.
Do you remember what school you attended?
School number 2, rural school number 2. There was 3 schools in our district, rural number 1, number 2, and number 3. The first year we went to rural school number 2, south of us 3 miles. Then after that we went to school 2 miles north of us. That was called rural school number 1, and that's where I went to school till I went through the 8th grade.
How old were you when you started school?
6 years old.
And since it was a rural school, was it a one-room schoolhouse?
For one-room schoolhouse, and the teacher sometimes had 17 or 18 pupils, and all 8th grades, so she had quite a handful of work to do with all those pupils.
Can you describe what a one-room schoolhouse looked like?
Well, it was very cold in the morning when we come there. And the first year I went, well, when it was so cold in the wintertime, the teacher would put us around the heating stove till the school got warmer. And some of the boys put their shoes up against the heating stove till you could smell the rubber on their shoes to start smoking. Then the teacher said, you better get away from the stove, too warm. And the water in the water cooler, if you didn't dump it at night, it would freeze. And your lunch at noon was so cold sitting under right under the bench where they kept the water cooler on that some of it almost froze sometimes, sandwiches. Then the second year we went, well, they had a furnace, so we'd take them down to the furnace and put them in the furnace with a stick, toast them a little bit.
How did you carry lunches to school?
Pardon?
How would you carry your lunch to school? Did you have like a lunch box, or what did you use? How did you carry your lunch to school?
Oh, we had them in buckets. Yeah, we had them in buckets. Then later on, of course, they started a hot lunch program in the early 30s. Each person had to bring 15 cents once a month for kerosene. So they had a little kerosene burner. Mr. Ockenholz brought that little kerosene burner for the school. And then at noon, if you had cocoa or something, they'd set it on there 11 o'clock, and by noon we had hot cocoa or soup or something. That helped a lot. We had something warm at least. That was quite a difference from eating that cold food all the time.
So you said that there was about 17 or 18 students in the class?
Yeah, in the 8th grades, yeah. From 1 to 8. One year, Mrs. Grace Carlson, she had all 8 grades, and there was 19 of us in school, if not even 21 for a while. She had a very heavy day every time, keeping all those pupils under control and giving them their education that they needed.
How would teachers discipline the students if they stepped out of line?
Well, at one time we had a teacher there, and us guys got out of hand a little bit, so Joseph Unkenholz, he was on the school board, so he went to town, bought a leather strap about 30 inches long and cut slits in it, and then Laura Myers came to school with this. She said, "This is what Mr. Unkenholz gave me. If you guys don't behave now," he says, "give them a couple of slaps with this and that'll straighten them out." And we did too.
When you were going to school, did you have, you said Mrs. Grace Carlson was your teacher?
Mm-hmm.
Was she your teacher for all 8 years?
No, she was, first year I had Margaret Sholin at the 1st grade, and then the 2nd year we had this Grace Falkenstein. She was great. She married Mr. Carlson later on. She stayed at this Joseph Unkenholz farm. And then off and on, then we had different teachers, different one every year, of course, all through the 8 grades.
Did you ever have a male teacher?
Yes, we had Chester Miller, yeah, the Methodist minister that lived right north of our farm. He was our teacher for 1 year, and he was very strict. Nobody got away with anything.
Could you speak German when you went to school?
Well, the first year we got kind of told out, we better not use the German language. She says, "You're here to learn the English language." Where in the early days, my mother taught us the religious German prayers. We had to learn them in Germany because my sister, when she went to parochial school, they had everything in German. So we learned the prayers in German. And then when I started to go to parochial school in 1930, then everything was English. So we knew them in German and in English. But I learned my English language after the 1st grade. So many of us couldn't talk a decent English language. We speak German all the time when we were younger.
When you started school, did you know how to speak English?
A little bit, pretty much so, but a scissor, I called it a shear. That's a German name, yeah. When somebody took my scissors, I says, "Teacher, somebody took my shear," instead of scissors. Yeah, then she said, "That's a scissors." You know, in English it's a scissors. We didn't use that word at home.
So did your teachers speak German, or did they know how to speak German?
The first teacher didn't, and the second teacher didn't. But later on, we went to the school number 2 for a while, till they could find a teacher for rural school number 1. That teacher could talk German. And every once in a while, she'd catch me and my cousin talking German. She says, "Don't speak that Dutch language. You're supposed to speak English."
So you said that you went to a parochial school in 1930. Why did you switch to a parochial school?
Just to get your Catholic religion, catechism, and the First Communion and confirmation. 31 and 30. I went to 1930 and 31 when the church burned down. Then the Catholic Church at St. Anthony burned down. Then we had church in the auditorium in the school that they built in 1928 to build a new school. That's where we had church then until they built a new church. And that was opened about 1937 or 38, just the basement. And then they finished the rest of the church, I think maybe 3 years later, they put the rest of the church. So it's still there at St. Anthony now. They still have church there every But in 30, after the church burned down, we transferred to Mandan to St. Joseph's Church because the roads were a little better. So we went to church at Mandan from then on out. But St. Anthony Church is still there. They have services every Sunday.
So you said the church burnt down in
1931. They had a wedding there, and they must have banked the furnace too strong. Didn't check it, and when they were eating supper in the basement in the school, in the auditorium, the priest's cook came over and says the church is on fire. They couldn't save it no more. It burnt to the ground, the church at St. Anthony.
Do you remember at all how that impacted the community?
Yeah, it was kind of, they had church away on the third level on the three-story auditorium. They had church up there on Sundays. And during the week they had just mass at the chapel in the old schoolhouse. There was an addition to it. Old school was there first, and then they added a new addition in 1928. But that was so cold up there sometimes in that church, third level. You know, heating systems weren't like they were today.
So can you tell me a little bit about what parochial school was like? What did you do?
Well, I was in the second grade the first year, and then the next year I went for a while to confirmation in the third year. And the sisters, they were very strict. And if it kind of cold outside, we'd have to stay inside and play down in the area where we had our dining room. And if you didn't straighten out, the sister would take you by the bib overalls and take you and pound you right in against the corner, against the rocks. Me and one of my friends, both of us, were just having a little fun and got a little noisy, and she got mad and she took us, that old rock riprap, she took us and just slapped us against that cement there. You could feel the next day your head was still hurting from it. They got away with it. That was discipline those days.
So where was this school in relation to your farm?
The parochial school was 11, 12 miles from home. We'd board there. We'd stay there all week. And my mother would send for it. There was a list we'd get every week. Take home, you had to bring a gallon of milk and a couple of loaves of bread or whatever. Next week, something else, canned goods. That's what you had to bring, because they had 50 boarders at that school from all around St. Anthony area. The men's dorm had sometimes 25 or 30 boys, and the girls had probably almost that many. Once they had 54 boarders there, I remember. The sisters, and they had their hands full cooking 3 meals every day for those people. And when the weather was bad, those kids couldn't get home sometimes. Roads were blocked, so they had to stay there for sometimes 2 or 3 weeks at a time. Then their dad would come once in a while during the week and bring clean clothes for them and some milk and bread and whatever. It was pay. Everybody had to bring their share. And once a month somebody was asked to bring a box of apples for the pupils, so they had an apple after school. I remember my mother brought a box of apples, and then the next time when that was gone, somebody else on the list that had kids there, it would be their turn to bring a box of apples. They weren't very costly. I think for $1.50 you could buy a 40-pound box of apples those days.
Do you remember, were you scared at all moving into boarding at the school, not living at home with your parents and your sisters and brothers?
Come again.
Were you scared when you were left for the first time for overnight at the parochial school? Was that kind of scary for you?
Yeah, some of the boys would go cover their head and they'd cry. They were homesick. And in the morning, the nun would come and tell us to get up, and you had to make your bed. And if it wasn't made right, you had to do it over. And we went up and to wash our face and hands, and the water was froze in the morning. It woke you up real fast. There was no indoor plumbing or anything. So we had to carry the water up to that second level from the well the day before, in the evening after school. so we had water to wash our face and hands in the morning.
What type of chores did you have at the parochial school that you had to do?
Well, like carrying water, and when the sisters wanted to do their washing clothes on Mondays or Tuesdays, they had about 9 or 10 sisters there. And then we had to carry the water in and put it in the barrel when they'd heat it up to do their washing. And the girls, they'd help wash dishes downstairs in the kitchen after supper, and the boys there was always something to do. We'd help. The spring we had to help put up the screens. They had winter, in the winter time they had storm windows on. So we put the screens on way up in the 3rd level where the sisters stayed. And we were glad to do something like that. It was different. Then we had to chop little short pieces of wood out there so they could start their fire in their kitchen range in the morning. Then we tied them up in little bundles, just about 16 inches long, little sticks, and we each one, 2 of us together, we tied them in. They gave us twine and we tied them together, and then we had to make those bundles, and they saved them for all summer when they wanted to start their cook stoves.
Can you tell me a little bit about what type of instruction you got, what classes you took at the parochial school?
Just the regular 8th grade, up on 1st grade, 2nd grade level, and then next year the 3rd. And of course the religion, we had to learn the religion, mass prayers and so on. But they were Latin, and I couldn't get anything out. I didn't know what Latin words meant to me, so it wasn't very interesting, very hard for me to learn the Latin. Where some of them had no problem at all. My cousin, he said it's easy for him to read it, and I couldn't read the Latin.
Did you ever learn how to read the Latin?
Mm-mm. Not really.
The nuns, can you tell me, were they friendly, or were kids kind of scared of them? What was the relationship with the nuns and the
Well,
students?
if you tried to learn and tried to behave well, the sisters were very nice to you. But if you tried to get away with something, they soon told you about it. I remember one sister, she just passed away a couple of years ago. She was Sister Mary Ursula. Her maiden name was Tokach. They lived east of St. Anthony. Their daughter was a nun. And she was not very big, but she was strict and strong.
You said you completed 3rd grade at the parochial school?
No, just it's part of the 3rd grade.
Part of the 3rd
So
grade?
I was in there for, let's see, I think for a few weeks in the spring for confirmation. And then I went back to rural school again.
Why did you go back to the rural school?
Well, it was at home, no borders. See, we were in there the 2nd year for confirmation. I just stayed at my grandmother for those 2 weeks for confirmation instructions, where the 1st year I went to parochial school for the whole year to learn the religion and First Holy Communion and everything, and all those, plus my school education.
So what did you enjoy more, the rural school or the parochial school?
Well, I think the rural school probably was more like a school to me, because it wasn't this people. The sisters were much more on you if you didn't behave.
When you started school, do you remember what you wanted to be when you grew up?
I always wanted to be a storekeeper when I was young, because my mother, when she'd come to the store and we'd go along for groceries, we seen all those goodies. I said, someday I'm going to be a storekeeper. Then I can eat all the candy I want. And my mother said, you'll soon get tired of that when you get older. And that didn't work out at all for me. So I never was a storekeeper. I was a farmer from 1921 till I retired 10 years ago.
So when you were growing up, did you have quite the sweet tooth?
With who?
Did you have a sweet tooth for candy?
I did. I still like my ice cream. I buy ice cream every week. I still eat the ice cream.
How often often could you have candy when you were growing up?
Oh, at sister's school, when we had a nickel, we'd go across the street to the grocery store and buy a nickel's worth of candy, and sister would notice we had candy in our pocket, and then she'd take them away and put them in her desk. The Reverend Superior Mother said, if you want candy after school, come in and we'll give you one or two, but you're not going to eat candy all day. And some kids had them in their suitcase, and then we'd sneak upstairs in the dorm and open our suitcase and take some candy out. And she noticed that, and then she took them out of there and put them down there in her desk. We could get them from there.
So, did you ever go to a dentist when you were a kid?
Dentist?
Yeah.
Not while I must have been about 18 or 20 years old before I had my first tooth filling.
How about brushing your teeth? Was that something you did when you were growing up?
Yeah, we were supposed to do it at parochial school too, but the water was ice water. We had our toothpaste along, and we did it, but I don't think we did a real good job of brushing our teeth because it was so darn cold in that washroom.
Let's talk a little bit about what farm life was like. When you were growing up, what was it like growing up on a farm?
Oh, my dad had a Shetland pony. My brother would ride it all the time, and he was older than me. And I would have so liked to ride that horse too. So one day he let me ride it, and the horse knew where to go every morning to get the horses or the cows in. He turned around out in the barn, they had the saddle on, and he'd run the gallop, and by the time he run about 100 feet, I was on the ground already. I bounced off, I couldn't hold on to him fast enough, because I wasn't used to riding him. But later on, I rode lots of horses many years later, broke wild horses. We used to break horses later on, me and my brother, for $5. The neighbors would bring horses. We had to break them so they could ride them. And that was $5 bill was big money those days.
How would you break a horse back then?
Oh, we'd put the saddle on him. Never had a saddle on him before, and snupped him to the other saddle horse. A good horse that was very smart. We'd snup it to his saddle horn, and then I'd sit on the wild horse. And as soon as he tried to buck, my brother, he'd take his horse and make him go ahead real fast, and that tightened the rope on him, and he couldn't buck. So we broke horses that way. Once in a while, we took them in the plowed field, so we'd play them out because some of them were pretty wild. And $5 bill was big money, so we didn't want to spoil a horse. We wanted to make a good saddle horse out of him for the neighbors.
What was your brother's name?
Matt. Yeah, he was born in 1918.
So he was your older brother?
Yeah, he was. He farmed too all his life. He passed away 2 years ago.
So did you guys have a lot of horses on the farm when you were growing up? Did you have a lot of horses on the farm when you were growing up?
Oh yeah, my dad had a Belgian stallion, and he raced a lot of horses, and the neighbors would come and they'd bring their mares and to them, and that was that was the power we had those days, horsepower. Everybody had horses, and we had as high as 15 horses in our home. My dad had a 3-bottom plow, and he'd have 8 horses on that when he'd plow before the tractors came. He'd plow with 8 horses he had on there. And the hired man had 4 horses on the drill, so we had 12 horses in the barn at one time, every day in the springtime. And the harvest time was the same thing with the harvesting. We had headering or bindering, we had 8 horses. On the 4 in the binder, then we'd change every 4 hours. We'd bring different horses out when we'd harvest. And once I took some out at 4 o'clock, and they would use those horses till about 7 or 8 o'clock. And on the way home, those horses ran away with me. The ones he took off the binder, they ran away with me. And that was in 1932. And down the hill, I couldn't hold them, and they got out with the pole broke or something. The horses kept on running, and I got run over. The wheel went over my foot, and I couldn't walk for about 6 weeks. My foot was fractured right above the ankle. But I didn't go to the doctor. My mother took a white bed sheet and wrapped it around real tight, and narrow strips all around tight, and it healed that way. 1932 in August. From July till September, I couldn't walk on that one foot.
So, besides horses, what other type of animals did you have on the farm?
Cattle, yeah. Years ago we had a mixed breed, but then in 1938 we started strictly purebred Hereford cattle. We went in the purebred Hereford business. My dad sold Hereford bulls, and I did, my brother also did. And once we took a bull to a home on the range for the Medora. We donated a bull for the boys up there. Ray Schnell from Dickinson says to my dad, we'd take bulls to Dickinson's sales rig. He says, why don't you bring a bull and donate it to a home on the range? He said, Dad says, yeah. He says, that wouldn't hurt. So we took one up there, and I still see the picture we had where he stands in front of the home on the range barn with that bull and the little boy standing there too. They started their own herd, and they still have cattle up there at the home on the Medora, the home on the range. That was back in the, that was already in the late 40s when he took that bull up there.
So horses, cattle, any other animals?
Yeah, that's all we raised is horses and cattle. And while I remember, once my folks had a goat, but that was, they got it in the church fair, and that was a no-no. He'd jump on the top of a post next to the clothesline and tear the clothes off the clothesline and chew them up. When my uncle came with his car, he'd jump up on the top and punched holes into the canvas top in his car. Goats are terrible for that. They're in mischief all the time.
What did you end up doing with the goat? What happened to the goat?
I don't want to tell you.
Did you have any chickens or ducks and geese?
Mm-hmm. Yep, we had a lot of chickens and ducks. Turkeys. My mother raised turkeys, and before Thanksgiving she'd sell them, and that's where she got her money for Christmas shopping back in the 20s and 30s.
What did your dad also have crops? Was he a grain farmer as well?
A grain farmer, and the thrashing, had a big thrashing rig. Him and his dad bought one in 1918. Then later on, when his dad retired and moved to town, my dad bought a new one in 1928, a 36-inch separator, and they thrashed with that till 1956. We thrashed with it. We thrashed for all the neighbors. All the neighbors. It seemed like everybody we knew of helped haul bundles when we thrash with that separator. And the separator is now in Montana, where they thrash in the fall when they have these thrashing bees. In the fall, a guy came about 10 years ago and bought that separator, and he took it to Montana. It was a 1928 model machine. Took it to Belgrade, Montana, and if you want to see it work now, you'd have to go there every fall and Labor Day. They'd have a thrashing bee and have a steam engine there what they thrash with. I have a tape that they gave me from where they're thrashing with it now in Montana. Very interesting. So that separator 28, how old would that thrashing machine would be? That'd be about 70 years old, wouldn't it?
Yeah, next year.
Mm-hmm.
What type of crops did your father plant when you were growing up?
Oh, those days, wheat was number one. Not as much corn as we raise now because we didn't have that many cattle. Wheat and oats and barley, and even spelts once in a while, which is hardly ever raised anymore.
What is it?
Spelts, yeah. It's something like barley, but it was a different grain. People raised it those days, but in the 50s I didn't hear much about it, whether anybody was raising it anymore. I don't know if you can even, I don't think you can even buy it anymore. There's no more seed available that I know of. And now, of course, they raise soybeans and they raise flowers and everything else. Farming has changed, hasn't it?
So what type of equipment? I know you mentioned that you had a threshing machine, a binder,
A header. A header. Yeah, a header at harvest time. We'd cut with the binder till the grain got quite ripe, and then we take the header and put it in header stacks. Then the fall of the year, they thrash the bundles first for everybody, then they'd come back and thrash the header stacks later.
So what other type of equipment did you have on the farm when you were a kid?
Well, let's see. Most farmers, well, there was the mower to cut hay and the rake and a corn binder. And later on, it got to be a silage chopper when you quit cutting corn with a corn binder. And combines, of course. Now it's, since the thrash machine was parked.
What were some of the chores that you had to do on the farm as a young boy?
Milk cows in the morning and the evening. That was a must. That was the cream went to town. That's where Mother bought the groceries for the family. And eggs. We'd get 12 cents a dozen for eggs at one time at the store in town. And a can of cream brought $2.50 for 5 gallons, and 8-gallon can was $4, whatever. But Mother could buy quite a few items with $6 those days.
So besides milking cows, what else did you have to do?
Chickens, feed the chickens, gather the eggs and so on. And shock grain. When they'd start binding, we'd shock grain. Me and my brother and my sister, we'd shock grain. Then we had a hired man, he'd help too. We'd usually bind her about 100 acres or so, and then after that they'd start the header and cut the rest with the header.
Let's see here. Would you ever have to help in the house at all?
Not really that much. The girls were there. After I was married, when the kids were small, me and my wife, I'd help a lot sometimes in the house. When I was through with in the evening, I'd help wash dishes and so on. And there was always some odd things to do.
So how many brothers and sisters did you have?
Just one brother and 3 sisters. One lives in El Paso, Texas, and the other one is in a care center in Bismarck. And the third sister passed away about 4 years ago, the youngest girl. She was born in 1925. She died about 4 years ago. She had diabetes and heart problems. So there's still the 3 of us left, my sister, Monica, and Ida, and me, the living children in the family so far.
Can you list the children from the oldest to the youngest for me?
Monica was born in 15, and Angela, the youngest, was born in 25. But two children died. The little girl died in 17, and another one in 23. They're buried in St. Anthony.
Did they die in birth?
Yeah, one of them was very young, and the other one, I think, they died. I think one was just a few days old, and the other one was 3 months old.
How did the 3-month-old die? Just.
I have no idea. Did get pneumonia or something those days? I'm not sure what caused it, but one only lived a few days. My sister said. My dad and my mother's cousin made the coffin right at the house there for that baby. Monica says she remembers when they made the coffin for that little baby that died at home. Well, they did that a lot of times those days. They'd make their own little coffin, put nice sheet in there, the quilted little quilt. My mother, Monica said to put that in there and for the little baby, and they took it to St. Anthony and buried it.
So, how old were you when you first attended a funeral?
Pardon?
How old were you when you first attended a funeral?
Oh, in 1938 is when my grandpa died. He died in 1938 in August, and my brother and his cousins had to dig the grave at St. Anthony, and we all went to the funeral when my grandpa was buried, and his 6 sons carried their dead. That was my dad's brother John, and Alfred, and Henry, and Peter, my dad, and Valentine, and Nicholas Helbling. Those 6 boys carried their dead when they brought their hearse to St. Anthony. I still remember just like yesterday how they took that body and they carried it into that church. It was a church basement those days. So they took him down them narrow steps and had him there by the altar. And he's buried at St. Anthony where his wife is buried, that died in 1913.
Do you remember if the service was in German or was it in English?
It was in German. Father Andrew Kolbeck from St. Anthony, he was the priest there. He was there when I went to First Communion, and he was there till in the 40s. He moved to Motten and they had Father Emmanuel took over St. Anthony Parish then.
And what was your grandfather's name?
Valentine.
Did you know him before he passed away?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we used to come to town. My dad used to take a load of hay in when he first moved to town. After his wife died in 1913, then he got married the second time, but he moved to Mandan. He married a lady from Wilton. And then they had a cow in town and a horse. He'd drive out to the farm once in a while with a buggy, but not very often. Then my dad took a load of hay in for him, and every once in a while for his cow. And he had chickens in town. And he had a real nice garden on First Street. That house is still there, and it's still a nice house. Then after his, Benita Beeler died of, she had certain operation here, a strangulation of the intestine strangulation. And they couldn't save her. She had an operation. She passed away. And then he got married to that Mrs. Fowl from Wilton, and she was his wife for, I think 5 years, and she died. Then in 1924, he married another lady, a widow. So my grandpa was married 4 times. His first wife died in Russia.
Married, you said, how many times?
4 times, yeah. First one was in Russia, which I never learned to know, and Mina Beeler, we have a picture of her. She died in 13, and Mrs. Fowl, and then Mrs. Furter. I remember Mrs. Furter real well. He got married to her in 1924.
So who was your father's mother?
My father's mother?
Mm-hmm.
Amina Beeler. Jacob Beeler's daughter.
And you didn't really know her, right?
No, I never
died
met
before.
her. Yeah, she died. I never knew her, met her.
When you think back to your childhood, how would you best describe your grandpa? What type of a person was he?
Well, he was a very sober man. He didn't, he was all business. When you'd ask him something, he'd give you the answer, and he didn't converse much with you. He was, and we were even scared to ask Grandpa questions because we might ask the wrong thing. He was in the Russian army first when he in Russia, and then after that he came to America in 1893, and my dad was 3 months old that time. And they moved down into the Cannonball area, Fort Rice area there, and he worked on the Parkins Ranch, my grandpa did. That's still there, that Parkins Ranch, but they died, of course, and now they call it the Cannonball Ranch. And my dad was 3 years old, and my grandpa worked there at that ranch for till 1897. Then he took up a homestead west of St. Anthony, and that's where my dad grew up then, and the rest of the family. That farm is still there.
So your dad, was he born in Russia?
He was 3 months old when he came. He was born December 9th in 1893, and they came in May. They came in May 1893. They came to America.
Do you remember when you were growing up any other funerals that you had to attend to as a young boy?
Let's see. Well, my grandmother's funeral, that's my mother's. On my mother's side, she died in 51.
And what was her name?
Elizabeth Antone, maiden name, and Elizabeth Renner. Elizabeth Antone Renner, yeah. Yeah, she was the mother to my mother and Mrs. Weber and Mrs. Lawrence Welk and Ambrose Renner and Nicholas Renner and Joseph Renner. Her husband was Matthias Renner. He died in 1907 already. Ruptured appendix. Matthias Renner.
That was your grandfather?
Yeah, it was grandfather on my mother's side. I never remember him at all. But grandmother lived to be 82 or 83 years old. Elizabeth, my mother's, on the Renner side.
When you think back to your childhood, how would you best describe your grandmother?
Oh, on the Renner side, that grandmother, I remember her. She stayed at our house for maybe 1 year. Then she stayed at her son's, Ambrose. She stayed there for a year. And then she stayed at her brother-in-law, Joseph Renner, at St. Mandan for 1 year. And then we took her to Dickinson, to the St. Joseph's nursing home in Dickinson. And 48 or 49, and she got to where she needed special care. She died up there, and then she brought her back, and she was buried at St. Anthony.
What was it like having her stay with you?
Pardon?
What was it like when she was staying with you?
Oh, she was very easy to satisfy. She wasn't fussy or anything. When my mother would make food with potatoes or something like soup noodle or dumpf noodle or something like that, she just stood there by the pan and watched. She said, "That is such a good meal. That's what we always had in Russia when we had flour," she said, something like this. She told us more about Russia than anybody else did.
What were some of the things that she would tell you about Russia?
Pardon?
What would she tell you about Russia?
Oh, how they had to turn the cattle out, open the gate in the morning. Somebody would take the cows out in the field and herd them, and then the next door neighbor, the same thing. They'd open the gate and those cows would know it. She said they'd all go out in the evening when they'd come. She said we'd go out and open our gate and our cow would come right in again, and we'd shut the gate and so on down. And she said if you didn't lock the gates, somebody would come and milk the cow at night to steal your milk. She said, in Russia, it was terrible. She said there was people that would steal all the time. You didn't dare leave anything out. Same with the chickens, she said. There was, what did they call them? Thieves those days, she said.
Did she ever share with you why she decided to leave Russia?
Well, it got so bad, you know. They had, in 1919, one of her brothers got killed. Joseph Renner's brother got Gregory. They shot him, the Bolsheviks. They shot him. They said they're going to have a meeting at the school for all the men. They should come down there, and when they had them all in there, they locked the door and they shot them through the windows. Yeah, and Gregory, he said he knelt down, and his boys went under him, the younger ones, and they thought they were all dead. And those two boys, after everything was over, they walked to their aunt, and then they went out and they stayed behind this cross stack all night, and it rained all night. But those Bolsheviks, they went from one house to the other and killed all the men. It was terrible, they said. And Mr. Lantz got shot, and Mr. Janser, and Mr. Renner, Gregory Renner, they were all shot through the window that time. and they told him they're going to be there, coming there and take care of have a meeting so things go better, and they just lied. That was just an alibi. And then they went back to town about 11 o'clock that night and stayed with their aunt, they said, and they could still see those guys. They'd raped the women and everything, those communists. That it was just horrible, my grandmother said.
So your grandmother came over what year? What year did she come to the United States?
Also in 1893, yeah. The Renners also came. Matthias Renner came in 1893, and he settled in Fort Rice too for 1 year. The reason they did this is because there was this army there. They were scared of the Indians. In Fort Rice, they had an army there, so they felt more comfortable there in that area. And then they moved west to St. Anthony, just 2 miles south of where my grandpa Helbling settled.
What was your mother's name?
Rose Renner.
And was she born in Russia or was she born in the United States?
She was born here, 1894.
So how many, do you know how your mother met your father?
Well, they were only 2 miles apart, and there used to be little dances. They called it Strain, west of St. Anthony, little post office, and a stagecoach stopped there, and they had barn dances Sundays down there. They were only a mile either. On the Helblings only had about 2 miles to that little store, and my grandmother Helbling's, Renner's folks, they only were 2 miles from that store. Then they had Sunday afternoon dances, and that's where she met my dad.
When you think back, how would you best describe your mom when you were growing up?
Oh, she was a wonderful lady. She always tried to be, as hard as times were, but she always made the best of it. She'd sew our clothes and try to do always good meals, and had a little garden and everything. And she wanted to be a school teacher, but those days, and that just wasn't no money to send her to high school for a better education.
How about your father? What type of a father was he?
Oh, he liked to go to the parties. They had barn dances in our barn dance, but when work was ready for work, then he wouldn't fool around. Harvest time or spring's work, then he'd go and grind feed for the neighbors in the spring of the year. He'd go had a team, and he had a grinder on there and a motor in between. Then and the other end of the grinder, he had a sawmill on there. Then he'd cut posts for him or wood, and he'd grind feed for him for spring's work. He'd go all over as far as east of St. Anthony. So once in a while they still mention how you remember my dad, how they used to come to their place and grind feed. He ground for the Stecklers and for the Wrestlers and for the Gertels and the Millers. And years ago he ground feed. 50 cents a wagon load, 50 cents he charged to grind a wagon load of oats for the people for spring's work. Then they needed that. Of course they used that oats to feed their horses during spring's work. Then sometimes he'd grind 4, 5, 6 loads for them. And then he cut their wood too for them. In winter time they'd go to the Missouri bottoms or Hart River bottoms and bring wood home. Then he'd cut that for them so they had fuel for the summer, for the ranges. Then he'd do thrashing for them and so on. Then he even moved buildings for a while. In the 30s when there was no income, he'd move granaries for people, or even schoolhouses when they moved them from one place to the other.
You were born in 1921.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me what the Dirty 30s were like?
Let's see, 32, 33 were real warm. We had a man helping us. We had a small harvest. 34, there was hardly anything. In 35, we had a real nice crop, real tall and a lot of rain, but then the rust came and the grain was barely good enough for feed. A bushel of wheat only weighed 34 pounds. And at 36, we had all that snow that winter. We had 2 feet of snow all over, and we couldn't travel hardly. And that snow left us in the spring, and by the middle of May we had 80 and 90-degree temperature, and we had nothing but pitching grass and thistles in 1936. And real hot weather, humid in the morning, and by 11 o'clock the sun would come out, and we'd cut thistles for hay. Russian thistles, green ones. That was, oh, you had to haul them early in the morning. It was, if you didn't wear long overalls, the stickers were terrible. And grasshoppers, oh, it was, well, you've probably heard of all the grasshoppers they had in the 30s. That the sun sometimes they'd fly across the sun, and that got cloudy. They came from the south. There's millions of grasshoppers. They'd sit on the fence posts on the north side in the afternoon, just by the hundreds, and they'd eat the outside of the cedar posts. They'd eat them. They looked like new posts. They'd eat the bark off the cedar posts. It was terrible.
Did you ever witness a sandstorm?
Yeah, we had a lot of them. One day from the south east it would blow the sand north, and the next day it would be vice versa. It would smoke from the northwest, it would blow it back south again, 30-40 mile an hour wind. We shingled one of the buildings in the 47, and every time we lifted the shingles there was more dust coming out underneath, where it blew it in under those shingles and it stayed there. It was terrible. And the house, the windows, my mother had to clean between the windows every day when the dust came through.
How would you keep the animals, get the animals water at that time?
Well, we had a creek there. We had a neighbor came and dug our well deeper, so we had water. But the neighbors east of us, they'd bring their cattle. The Shumiks lived east of us. They'd bring them down to the Little Heart Creek that's right west of us. About once a day they'd come in there. That was just a half a mile south of us. They'd come there and they'd drink water, and then they'd take them home again after an hour, and the next day the same thing again.
Did your parents ever get government assistance to help them during the Dirty 30s?
Some people did. My dad didn't get it, but he made a seed loan in 1937 after 36, and he said, that was big money. It was $280. And then he bought gas to farm with, and bought some seed wheat and everything. And then we had a decent crop in 38. We had a little better crop. He bought Thatcher seed wheat. That was a new variety that was rust resistant. And then in that wheat in the fall of the year, it went 14 bushel to the acre, and we thought that was wonderful. And then right away, Mr. Sander from St. Vincent came when we were threshing. He said he wanted to buy that seed wheat. And then my dad sold him 2 loads. Next day, we were threshing south of Mandan at Albin Nelson. He came, he says, I want to buy all that seed wheat you have. And my dad says, no, he says, I need some. See, Mr. Sander was quite a businessman. He had somebody that wanted to buy that wheat, so he was going to make himself a little money off of my dad's seed wheat. So my dad says, no, 200 bushel is all we can give you. And the rest we kept and used it for seed. We sold, and wheat was only 60 cents a bushel those days.
Do you know what year things started to kind of turn around from the Dirty 30s?
The 40s, 40, 41, 42, it was, got good crops through those years.
Can you tell me a little bit, can you describe the home that you grew up in? What did it look like?
It's still there. House has a hardwood maple floor in it. I live in the same house my dad built in 1918. And it's got a furnace in the basement that was put in 1925 or 26, one of those years. And we converted it into a stoker in the 40s. And my son brings me a load of stoker coal that lasts me all winter, every winter, to heat the house. And of course then we got electricity in the 50s. We had carbide lights first in the house that they put in the 20s, late 20s, and then we got into the RE when power came through, rural power, and we've been on that ever since.
So when you were growing up, how many rooms were in the house?
There's 2 bedrooms upstairs and 1 downstairs. And the kitchen, of course, we added on. When I got married, we added on to the north side where me and Rose lived till my folks moved to town. Then that's where our family lived then. So we had 3 bedrooms then. Actually 4 in the apartment, but then when they moved away, we made a recreation room out of that apartment on the north side. And my son lives in a mobile home behind my house, him and his wife.
So when you were growing up, what type of furniture was in the house?
Well, there was a bedroom set that my mother got from her mother. She had that for many, many years. And I think when grandmother died, the estate had a little money, and each of the family, the Renner family, got $500 each, and my mother bought herself a new bedroom set those days. $500 was, that was big bucks back in those days. So they gave each, Mrs. Welk got 500, and Ambrose Renner and her brothers, and Mother used hers to buy a bedroom set. She had some left over.
So you mentioned that when you were growing up, there were 2 bedrooms upstairs. Were those for the kids?
Pardon?
You mentioned when you were growing up, there were 2 bedrooms.
Mm-hmm.
Did
Yeah.
the kids sleep in those?
Yeah, the girls slept in one, and me and my brother slept in the other upstairs. And then we had an extra bed in the west room where the hired man slept too. We had a hired man when we were younger. And we boarded the teacher once. The teacher that taught rural school number 2, she boarded there one year.
What was that like when the teacher was boarding with you?
Well, she had that room, and upstairs, the east room, and our girls slept down on one of those Davenports that you fold up and made a bed out of. That's where the girls slept. They were small yet then. Monica went to school too. I think she went to school that year already, where we didn't. That was back in the 20s.
So in the bedrooms, were there more than one bed, or how did that work?
There was one bed in the east room, and we had 2 beds in the west room where me and my brother and the hired man slept.
So did you have the same hired man all of your childhood?
No, we had different ones. Once we had my cousin, Uncle John's son, Ralph, he worked up for us. And Stanley's brother was there once, Stanley Helbling's brother, Johnny. When we hauled bundles, threshing time, they'd stay overnight, they'd sleep there. And then we had a guy from Minnesota. My dad took a load of hay to town to Grandpa, and he seen this guy on the street. He jumped off of a train, and my dad said, "Are you looking for work?" He says, "Yes, I'm looking for work." So my dad says, "I can hire you." So he hired him that spring, and he stayed till after threshing the fall. Then he went back to Minnesota again. Mr. Klein, he was a very good hired man. He couldn't find work in Minnesota, so he came North Dakota and he found work. He went along with the threshing crew till after threshing. Then he took the train and went back to Minnesota where his mother lived.
So a hired man, what would your father pay a hired man?
Well, some of them could get $150 a year, and some room and board, and I think some of them were even less than that years ago. Sometimes he'd only have them through spring's work. But this one here, I think he got $150 from spring till fall.
And they always shared a room with you and your brother?
Yeah, he was, and he was very helpful around the yard. He was just like one of your own family.
So, if your room had 2 beds, did you sleep in the same bed with your brother?
Yeah, we slept in that bed for years together till Matt got married. Now the house is there, and I'm all alone in it. Where there was 7 of us all the time. When the family grew up, then of course Rose and I, we had 5 children, so we had that house too when Dad and Mother moved to town.
So when you were growing up, did your dad ever hire you out to somebody?
No, we just exchange help during threshing. We'd help the neighbors and the neighbors would help us thresh. Then we do a little custom combining later on for some people.
And how would your family keep the house warm during the winter months?
The house warm? Oh, with the furnace, yeah. We had no problem. But it was never like when we installed the stoker, that was thermostatic controlled, then we had nice warm house then.
And what year did you do that in?
In 1944, we put the stoker in.
How would you keep it cool in the summertime?
Open windows with it, but not like yesterday. And my mother watched it. She kept the shades down when it was real hot in the house so the sun wouldn't get in. But it was hot those days, very hot in the house. They were used to it. They'd cook for threshers when they had 10, 12 people for dinner. Those women would cook in that hot kitchen with the range going and everything, but they survived.
When you were growing up, did the men ever help in the kitchen, or was it strictly a woman's place?
Strictly a woman's job, except the stove. They take care of the furnace. My dad always took care of the stove, or bring wood in once in a while but us kids would go and get the wood from the wood pile keep the range going. Everything was cooked in a coal range.
Did the girls ever help out in the field?
Yeah, they helped shock grain when they were old enough. One little one, Angie, would carry the pail with water or the jug, and the rest of us would shock together. After my dad started bindering, we'd go out there and shock. And we had to watch for rattlesnakes those days. There was rattlesnakes in the fields. Once me and my sister just got out of the truck to start shocking, and we got to the first windrow of bundles to pick up, and there was a rattlesnake laying there already, but we had a bundle fork along, so we killed it. But we had lots of rattlesnakes in the 30s in our area.
Did you ever know anybody that got bit by a rattlesnake?
Well, my brother crawled through the fence once to go to help shock, and there was thistles under the fence, and he had those leggings on. Like motorcycle boys, he had them on, and he stepped on a rattlesnake, and she struck the one side and the other side trying to bite him, and then he came back to the house, and you could still see the marks and the poison on there where she tried to bite him. Then my dad took the mower and he cut along the fence line to see if he could find her, and he couldn't find her. She was under the thistles. She crawled away. And once we had one right across the sidewalk in front of the house, a rattlesnake. My mother took, that was on the 18th of August, we were combining. And she was going to go out, and here a rattlesnake was laying across the sidewalk, so she took the hole and killed it. And once the mailman came to deliver a package, and he says, "You know, you've got a rattlesnake right under the lilac bush out there." They wanted to go where there's shade. There was lots of rattlesnakes years ago. Now we don't see any anymore. We never got bit, but we had a lot of them around the yard.
Were there any other animals or rodents that were pests and annoying when you were growing up?
Well, there's skunks, of course. They're around, and raccoons. We didn't know raccoons were around there, but they'd go at night, and they'd go in the barn, and if they'd look for eggs if there's a cluck in there, they'd kill it. They even killed the cluck sometimes if she was on the nest. Then we set traps. We caught a couple of cocoons, but they're pretty smart.
So did you ever do trapping when you were a kid?
Shocking.
Trapping. Did you trap like gophers or weasels or?
Yeah, I used to help a little bit. My mother, I'd have to help pick out a few things. But we'd always pick out things that we liked, and sometimes that didn't work. Yeah, she wanted mostly groceries, and we'd pick up more candy than we should have.
So when you were growing up, did you go hunting at all?
Yeah, we went hunting. Me and my brother, we would go hunting. We had, in the fall of the year, my brother-in-law would come. We'd be as 5, 6 of us would go out hunting pheasants back in the 40s. And sometimes we'd come home with 35 pheasants in the fall, and had a whole wash boiler full of them. You know, you were allowed 7 birds those days, 5 roosters and 2 hens. And there was 5 of us hunting, so we had lots of good hunting.
How old were you when you got your first shotgun?
Oh, let's see, 40 during the war, 42 or 43, a man in Mandan advertised an old double-barrel gun for $20, and you couldn't buy shells, but he had a full box of shells, so we bought it. My dad bought it for me, and I still have that gun.
Really?
Mm-hmm. I have some better guns, but we still have that gun.
So did your dad teach you how to hunt?
Yeah, he had a shotgun. I went out with him once, the first time I ever seen a man shoot a gun like that. I was young, and I called my brother. I says, my dad doesn't shoot him off the ground. I says, they got up in the air and he brings him right down. Now, that's the first time I ever seen anything like this. Grouse were tame those days, and he'd shoot 3 or 4 of them when they were flying out in front of the car. When they'd fly up, he'd get out there and shoot them. Him and his mother's cousins, they'd go duck hunting too in the fall of the year. He always liked, and fishing. They'd go fishing years ago. We'd go swimming, and they'd go fishing in the Heart River. They used to fish net years ago and out in the Heart River, and those fresh fish were wonderful when you bring them home and clean them and cook them right away, fry them.
So did you know how to swim when you were a kid?
Right, yeah, but one time we almost drowned, me and my 2 cousins. We were at the Heart River, my cousins were there, and my dad and their dad were fishing, and here the June race, the water came all at once, a foot of water came down the river, and we were in there, and we were in up to our neck, me and Bill and Edward Helbling, and Mrs. Helbling said to her husband, come up here, the boys are going to drown. And he says, what? And then she hollered, and he came up, and he barely got us out yet. We were already bouncing in the Heart River. The water gets, we were swimming, we thought nothing of it. All at once, a whole foot of water came all at once from a heavy rain up the river. And if it wouldn't have been for him, we'd all 3 drowned.
So how did you learn how to swim?
I guess in the dam or up at Ellison's by the Heart River, we'd go up there with my mother and her cousin and my dad, and we'd always go up for a picnic lunch, and then we'd go in the water, and little by little. Hired man, I think, learned us how to swim. He was along. And now the children, I guess, take their swimming lessons in high school. They learned it long before we did.
What about fishing? Did you ever go fishing when you were a kid?
Not much. I wasn't much of a fisherman. I'd like to hunt more than fishing. My dad went fishing. We'd go along with him, and we'd roll the cream can along in the water when they used to net. Whenever they'd come out to a sandbar, to a lantern net, then we'd go and take the big fish and put them in the cream can. And him and his brother-in-law would keep on fishing till we had enough fish to satisfy us, and then we went home again. We thought that was great.
So how far was the Heart River from your house?
8 miles.
And how would you get there?
Car. Yeah, we'd take the car and tie the net in the back bumper I still remember that net. He had 2 wheat sacks over it, grain sacks, and then he tied it in the back of the bumper of the car. Then they'd unroll it and they'd go fishing. It was illegal, but they never got caught. And once they went fishing in the evening, and the car came by the Heart River, and my dad said, we better get out of the water, the game warden is coming. And then Mr. Tony Stark said, you're all right, but me, he says, I'm a deputy game warden, I'm not supposed to be fishing. He says, I'm fishing with you tonight. If they catch me, he says, I'm all done.
So what about in the wintertime? What about like sledding or ice skating?
We'd go skiing, tobogganing in wintertime, sometimes till 1 at night, Christmas vacation. Neighbors would come, or we'd go to the neighbors, and then we'd come home. We'd have a freezer of ice cream and everything. We'd go all the way to my mother's uncle, 6 miles with the horses and sled. And my uncle would come out, Uncle Henry would come out on the road, and he says, Pete, where are you going? He says, oh, we're going to Joe Ritter's. Tobogganing. Tobogganing? Yes, he says, the kids want to go tobogganing. He says, I've never heard of anything like that, my uncle said. And we were down there till about 10 o'clock, and then we come to the house. We had ice cream, and then we got home about 12:30 or 1 o'clock with the horses. It's not enough driving 6 miles with the horses or 7 at night. Of course, it wasn't that cold either.
And ice skating? Did you ever go ice skating?
Mm-hmm. Yep, we went ice skating a lot, me and the neighbors. On our creek, we had the Little Heart Creek there. The neighbors to the north would come down there sometimes and have a skating party. They'd build fire out there at night, and they just takes a bunch of old thistles and build fire, and you keep warm by the fire. But they had a lot of fun skating. Very good sport too. Very healthy for your system.
So did you have actual ice skates, or did you just use your shoes?
I had ice skates. Mm-hmm. First, the ones that you clamp on with a little wrench. Then later on, I bought myself a pair of shoe skates. I never did go roller skating though.
What other types of games did you play as a boy?
Oh, when the neighbors would come, we'd play hide and seek outside at night. And moonlight. We'd play that every time the neighbors would come, or we'd get to their house. It was very common for the neighbors to come to visit during the week. Every week somebody would come and visit for a few hours in the evening, or we'd go to somewhere, especially on Friday nights when there was no school on Saturdays.
So who were your neighbors when you were growing up?
Pardon?
Who were your neighbors when you were growing up?
Oh, my uncle to the east was Nicholas Helbling, my dad's brother. He was only 1.5 miles. And the Unkenholzes lived north, and the Eckroths lived about 1.5 miles to the east. We'd go skating on their dam, and my mother's brother lived about 4 miles up. Take a horse ride up to visit with their kids. And sometimes folks would drive up there, but once in a while I'd take a horse ride up there and visit, or they would come down to visit with the horse. They'd ride the horse down there, and pretty soon somebody would knock at the door. They had their horse tied in the barn, ready. Then we'd stay. They'd stay for about 2-3 hours, and then go home again.
You mentioned that you'd play hide and seek. Were there any other types of games that you would play?
Tag, I think. We'd play tag. Mm-hmm. And hide and seek. At night it was mostly hide and seek.
How about any indoor activities? What would you do inside for fun?
Oh, cards. We'd play cards.
Do you remember any of the games that you played?
Rummy. We played rummy. And whist. Whist, a lot of times. As we got older, we played whist and schmear. That was very good games.
What about any toys? Did you have toys when you were growing up?
Not very many. Buffalo nickel, you're talking about coins that were worth some money. My dad gave me a buffalo nickel ones, but they'd be worth quite a little money maybe this day, but when we got a coin, we spent it right away.
Let's talk about your home a little bit more. When people would come over to visit, would the kids be allowed to be inside, or did they have to go outside and play?
Yeah, we had to stay in the kitchen. They'd go in the living room and visit in there. We had to stay in the kitchen. Then we'd play games like button, who's got the button, or something like that. If we got a little bit noisy, somebody soon told us about it.
So what is button, who's got the button?
Oh, they'd come, they had put a button in your hand, and 6 people would sit there and hold their hands out, and they didn't know if you dropped the button into your hand or this way or that way. Pretty soon they say, button, who's got the button? Then they'd have to guess who had it, you know. You could cheat a little bit, but whoever had the button, that's the one that got to pass it out the next time then. That was a popular game back in, that came from the old country, I think. My mother taught us that game.
Do you remember any other games your mother taught you?
Cards, the first cards, my grandmother played that too. she liked to play it with us when she was there. That's a game they played in Russia, I guess. It's an old card game. I forget how it goes now. But she liked that when she comes evening. She said, let's play a little of that kind of do-raggles. They called it do-raggles, so I don't know what that means.
Did your mom play with you often when you were a kid?
Not so much, but later on when we got older, my dad and mother and me and her cousin that they had him come over from Germany, then we'd play Schmier at night after supper, card game. They had him come over here after the Second War. His folks were taken away at night. In Russia, they came at night and they took their dad first, and then they took their mother, and I guess dad died in Siberia. This Emanuel Anton's dad, and his mother, they took her to Poland, I guess. She worked there till she starved.
So when you were growing up, did anybody in your family play a musical instrument?
My dad played a button accordion many years ago, and he had a hired man there. Matt Reisenauer was there, and they had two accordions, and they'd sit out on the porch and play the accordions, and the dogs would squeal when they hear that music at night. It was unreal. Then George, my brother-in-law, he had a band, Eckroth Music. They have the music store in Bismarck now. He married my sister, Monica. He was a musician from way back in the 40s already. They got married in 36, and he was a musician already then. He passed away a few years ago. But his sons have the Eckroth Music here in Bismarck, and Fargo too, I think.
You mentioned a little bit of World War II. Do you remember where you were and how you heard about Pearl Harbor?
The next morning after that happened on the Sunday morning in Pearl Harbor, and we didn't get the news till Sunday evenings on the radio. Mondays when we went to town, they had the Tribune on the Man and Pioneer. They were selling them like hotcakes on the street. Everybody wanted to. And my cousin Albert Renner was there at Pearl Harbor, and he was in the West Virginia, and that was right next to the Oklahoma, where the smoke bomb went down the smokestack, and it shattered both ships, and he's buried at sea there. And Pearl Harbor is my cousin Albert.
How did World War II impact your life when you were?
Well, it was quite a shock. I went to Fort Snelling and for my physical, but then when I came back, I was ready to go to the service, and then that day we got a card that they don't need any more servicemen now. That looks like the war is going our way, so I was discharged then from going. I was ready to, I had my suitcase packed and everything to leave on a Monday, and we got a letter in the mail that we don't have to go to Fargo to go to the war.
Did your brother have to serve?
No,
How did the rationing affect your family at all?
The what?
The rationing with.
We had to watch it. Yeah, they had so many pounds of sugar, and I think only food stamps. Sugar stamps, and gasoline rationing. You were only allowed 10 gallons. Farmers with 5 gallons a week, I think, is all we were allowed for the car. Mm-hmm. I might be wrong. It might have been more, but it wasn't very much. You probably got stamps for gas too. I'm not sure, but for sugar you had stamps. So everybody quit using sugar in their coffee.
Let's see here. I'm going to ask you a couple of just general childhood questions. When you think back to your childhood, what is one of your scariest experiences?
What was I scared of?
What was one of your scariest experiences as a young boy?
I guess going out to shut the chicken coop after dark.
What is that?
we always had somebody else go with us for fear. Well, that was the old story. There's a mean man out in the dark all the time, and everybody was. And when our children, when we told them to shut the chicken coop if they didn't do it before dark, Sonia would always say, "Marlis, you better go with me. I'm not going to go alone." Something about scared about the dark. There was no yard lights those days.
How far was the chicken coop from the house?
Oh, I would say about half a block, maybe a little, about a half a block from the house. But it was dark, pitch dark out, never scared.
How about one of your happiest memories from your childhood?
Oh, I guess when 4th of July picnics.
Oh. Can you tell me what a 4th of July picnic was like?
Oh, we had, sometimes we had a barn dance in our hayloft, a big hayloft, and the Steckler boys would come to play. And they had a large crowd. By 2 o'clock, we had all kinds of people that come already for the 4th of July celebration. And we had firecrackers. It was quite exciting for us young children. And that dance would go sometimes till 4 in the morning. The musicians would play.
Firecrackers, would the kids set those off?
That wasn't much. It was just those little cap guns. We had those little cap guns. I think you paid 5 cents for a roll of caps, and you had the little cap gun. We thought that was quite the thing. I know I got one of those cap guns for a few cents, and after the 4th of July, I never found it no more. Somebody else liked it better than I did. It was gone. I showed him how it sounds like, and I laid it back in the ice house above the ledge, and the next morning it was gone. He figured that's a good place to find it.
So you'd always have 4th of July at your farm?
Quite a few times we had 4th of July celebrations. Dances, barn dances, that's when all the neighbors came from 20 miles direction, 15 miles.
About how many people would come over?
Oh, sometimes we had about 50, 60 people there, or 70.
Would your mom do a lot of cooking, or would everybody bring in food?
Mother had, they bought cherries, and they had watermelon and so on, and nobody came for dinner. They'd always come in the afternoon. And some of them were there for supper even. Some came after supper. But I know some of them came at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and I think my mother, they always had spring chicken or something, or potatoes. That was very common for fixing big meals when neighbors come those days. Where today it's very seldom that people fix big meals at home anymore.
How about an adventurous memory? Was there ever something that you thought was such an adventure as a young boy?
Not really. We didn't get very far. We just rode to the neighbors with the saddle horses and so on, and to the river. Once in a while we rode to the river with the horses. 1932, saddle horses were the first thing you'd get on every morning to get the cows and the horses in, and they were used to traveling. You could go 15 miles with a horse without even worrying not to get in there.
Would you ever race the horses when you were growing up? Would you race them with
No.
your brother?
No, I didn't.
Is there anything else about your childhood experience that you wanted to share before we look at some pictures?
Let's see. No, not really. I remember how cold it used to be when we went to school in 1936 or 35. That one morning my mother said it was 34 below, and we went to school, but it was real quiet, no wind. We went out and took the sled or the horses, a lot of snow. And we drove to school. Me and Angie were the only ones going to school yet. And she says, if we'd known it was this cold, we wouldn't let them to school. But we didn't think it was bad because we were used to cold weather. 36 was an awful cold winter. I think for many days it never got above 0.
How would your mother dress you when it was really cold? Like what clothes would you wear?
Yeah, we had pretty good overcoats. We had an overcoat on, a scarf, and the boy that drove the horses usually had an extra scarf to keep his eyes. And the horse would have icicles on his nose and frost on his whiskers on his face, the horse, from the cold frost. And the horse's eyebrows were full of frost.